History as it happens, April 28th, 2022. Vladimir the Historian. When Vladimir Putin delivered an hour-long address on Russian television days before he ordered his armies to invade Ukraine, viewers were treated to a long history lesson. Russia's dictator repeated ideas he'd been sharing for years. In retrospect, his case for war against his neighbor. Putin wages war on history too, and that's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We did read him wrong. I went to, endless sort of Zoom seminars with lots of sort of wise old figures, in the run-up to this war. And when the idea was mooted that Putin was becoming irrational, this was not such an unusual thing. He's been 22 years in power, to have the 2 years of isolation from COVID, which we know he's very paranoid about. People weren't allowed to meet him face to face, except very rarely, and then they had to quarantine themselves before they went into the meetings. But when that idea was floated, it was always slapped down. It was always, no, he's the same old sly fox.
When Ronald Reagan delivered his farewell address in January 1989, he invoked the past to validate his own legacy. The Reagan Revolution was about freedom, just as the Pilgrims' voyage to American shores had been.
The past few days, when I've been at that window upstairs, I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. He journeyed here on what today we'd call a little wooden boat. And like the other pilgrims, he was looking for a home that would be free.
And in his classic Reagan manner, with a sunny optimism, he called on Americans to renew their patriotism by studying their history. A heroic version of the American past, of course, meant to cultivate pride in our origins and institutions because something important was at stake.
I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory that could result ultimately in an erosion of the American spirit. Let's start with some basics. More attention to American history and a greater emphasis on civic ritual. And let me offer lesson number one about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it.
All American presidents have used and sometimes abused history to justify their policies, to make us feel good about our country, to attack their critics, whatever. Maybe you take this stuff seriously, maybe you don't. After all, it is to be expected. Now, were you paying attention on February 21st when Russia's president rambled on about history and war for a solid hour? It was 3 days before Russia would invade Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin wanted to make sure his countrymen understood what was going on. In his view, an independent Ukraine was a dangerous fiction. I would like to emphasize again that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us, Putin said as he launched into his monologue. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual place. Maybe you roll your eyes when an American president invokes the Pilgrims of the Continental Congress. But I wondered what ordinary Russians thought as Putin went on and on about Lenin's mistakes or Russia's claims to certain lands in the 17th century. But I wouldn't be surprised if many people actually took it seriously, because Putin's version of history is the foundation for his war in Ukraine. From the 10th century to the October Revolution to the killing fields of the Second World War. In an essay in Foreign Affairs, the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, Reid, the former Kyiv correspondent for The Economist and an expert in Ukrainian history, writes, to many Western ears, Putin's historical claims sounded bizarre, but they were of more than casual importance. Far from an innovation of the current crisis, Putin's argument that Ukraine has always been one and the same with Russia and that it has been forcibly colonized by Western forces has long been a defining part of his worldview. Reid, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you very much for having me on.
You are joining us from the UK, but you had been in Ukraine for several weeks. I'm going to ask you about that to start before we dive into the history stuff here. You were in Lviv, Kyiv, and you also visited some of the areas outside of Kyiv, areas where the Russian army has withdrawn from. What was that experience like?
There's a great contrast between the different parts of the country, depending on how close to the fighting they are. So Lviv, which has been more or less unaffected apart from the odd rocket in the outskirts, there's almost a sort of adrenaline-fueled mood of sort of hope and activity and busyness, and the city's full of people and all the shops and the cafes are open. And, you know, on a nice spring evening, there were people strolling in the squares with ice creams and walking their dogs and so on. Now, when you talk to those people, a lot of them are displaced, but there's an amazing volunteer effort, and the whole place is actually rather heartening and very lively, you know, just very busy, full of people and activity. You go to Kyiv and it's empty still. There were a few more people there than there had been the week before, a few more cars, but still it felt like a lockdown city, you know, unnaturally quiet, sort of unnaturally clean air. You could hear the bird song, all that kind of thing, these sort of big empty streets, very few shops or cafes or anything open. And then you go to Buch or Hostomel, Irpin, these new-built commuter towns about half an hour, 40 minutes outside Kyiv, which they very much represented the new sort of Ukrainian middle class, you know, the nice residential, new-built residential areas, nice family homes, football pitches, multiplexes, you know, playgrounds, river walks, all that kind of thing. And they have all been wrecked. Every other building or more is a wreck. Lots of them burned out, others just have got sort of great sort of chunks missing, great sheets of roofing metal all over the place, twisted. That's one of the sort of features of the landscape. And telephone lines hanging in great tangles, craters everywhere, broken glass everywhere, rubble everywhere, broken windows everywhere. People are always telling you, watch your feet, because there's unexploded ordnance everywhere as well. And the level of suffering there has been truly awful, not only due to shelling, civilians sheltering from the actual fighting or being caught in the actual fighting, but from brutal, random, pointless violence by the occupying Russian troops. And you can walk up to anyone basically in the street and say, would you mind talking? And they will come out with a blood-curdlingly awful story of personal suffering, of violence which they've suffered or witnessed. It's everywhere. You don't have to chase these stories. Everyone has been through it. It's extraordinarily horrible.
Even as I watch the video on television and the footage of cities that look like something out of the Second World War, essentially shelled into ruins, it's still an abstraction. It's hard for me to believe, even as I look at it, that something like this is happening now. But it shouldn't be hard to believe.
I know, you know, I have covered the Donbass conflict. I went there several times in 2014 and 2015, but it was very different. It didn't involve nearly as much destruction. It was more about these sort of Russian-backed militias taking over. So what people were frightened of, particularly Ukrainians, of course, much more than foreigners, was being arrested and disappeared. It wasn't artillery you were frightened of or sort of being shot publicly in the street. This is a war. It's like the war you read in the history books. And it is extraordinary. As you say, you know, we know these appalling, pointless brutalities people visit on each other in, you know, South Sudan and sort of northern Iraq, and seeing it in this very normal sort of European, familiar European city is really, really horrible and really odd.
I know it's hard to make sense of war, but on one level, it doesn't make sense. What is Russia trying to accomplish if it wanted to incorporate Ukraine or dominate Ukraine? What's the point of reducing entire areas to ruins?
Well, this is one of the catchphrases in Ukraine now. Za что? What for? What's the point? It's a pure Russian nationalism. It's revanchism. It's a desire to rebuild the old empire. You know, it's a nostalgia not only for the Soviet empire, but for the Tsarist empire. Putin often invokes it and uses its symbolism and so on, and has ever since he came to power more and more. You know, Ukraine does, it's not just a Putin thing. It predates Putin. Ukraine has a special place in the Russian sense of identity. It's not the other for them in the way that Poles are and Balts are. You know, even the best, good, liberal, Putin-hating Russian sort of regards at some level Ukrainians just as a species of Russian. And in my experience, traveling around Russia for books, people often say, where did you learn your Russian? And I say, oh, I learned it in Kiev. I used to live in Kiev. And there's always a bit of a pause. There's this slightly suspicious pause because they're thinking, you can see them thinking, oh, she spent time in Ukraine. That probably means she's picked up these nationalist ideas from the Ukrainians and her understanding of Russia is incorrect and hostile. They've never taken seriously the idea of Ukraine as an independent nation.
We're going to explore those ideas that you discussed in your essay for Foreign Affairs. But when I was preparing for this conversation, read your essay, I went to my bookshelf and I looked for Margaret Macmillan's book from 2008, Dangerous Games, The Uses and Abuses of History. People, leaders, everyone needs a usable past, and how often the versions of the past that are used are entirely distorted, even entirely made up. She wrote that history provides much of the fuel for nationalism. It creates memories that help bring the nation into being. And she also quotes someone, an unnamed critic, who said, "A nation is a group of people united by a mistaken view about the past and a hatred of their neighbors." But on that note, Russians and Ukrainians haven't hated each other. I mean, they've married each other, they've coexisted, they share a religion, they speak each other's languages. What are your thoughts on what I just shared there?
That's right. There are to quickly fill in the background, Ukraine only had statehood in 1991. There'd been Ukrainian movements and Ukrainian national leaders before, but during power vacuum moments like, after the end of the First World War, for example, or towards the end of the Second World War, as the Red Army was pushing the German army back, and national governments have been declared, but they've never lasted for more than a few months and never had real power. So Ukraine only won statehood for the first time in 1991. So it is a new state, but that's not unusual in European terms. Most of the map of Europe was created in the last couple of hundred years.
A new state, but not necessarily a new nation of people.
Not a new nation. You can start right back with Kievan Rus if you want in the 10th century, but I'll start with the beginning of the 19th century and the modern national movement, which grew. It started off as a sort of language-based movement, all about using Ukrainian and standing up, but then it sort of expanded into standing up for Ukrainian rights and Ukrainian sense of self and so on as the century went on. And it evolved in parallel with very similar movements for the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Romanians and so on, all the other Central European nations that have been absorbed into bigger empires. And it was strongest in the Western third of present-day Ukraine, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire through the late 18th and all the 19th century, all the way up to the First World War. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire there was a sort of consultative element to it, and there was a diet in Vienna and so on, and there were local assemblies as well.
Yeah, lots of different languages, lots of different
languages. And Ukrainians were able to elect deputies to the Lviv Assembly, which is the capital of Western Ukraine. Also, the Austrians used them as a bit of a counterweight to the Poles. The Poles were the old ruling class, the landowning class in that area. And the Austrians wanted to boost the state of the Ukrainians, basically in order to play them off against the Poles and reduce the power of the Poles, who are much more of a sort of threat to Austrian rule. By the time you get to the First World War, you've got lots of Ukrainian language publishing, Ukrainian language university, cooperatives, buying cooperatives and selling cooperatives, sort of village reading rooms, all these things. That was in contrast, which was what was going on in Tsarist-ruled 2/3 of Ukraine. Kiev was under Tsarist rule from the 1680s on. So Kiev was ruled from Moscow from only a few decades earlier than Edinburgh, for example, was ruled from London. Through the 19th century, Petersburg cracked down increasingly on the Ukrainian sense of identity. And there were increasingly tough laws preventing Ukrainian language publishing and schooling, which culminated in the 1870s in this notorious ukaz of Ems, which banned almost everything. But because Ukraine was divided, its division, which is usually touted as its great weakness, this East-West division, actually worked in a sense to its advantage through the 19th century, in that the Western chunk, which was under Austrian rule, enjoyed these freedoms which the Russian chunk didn't. And later on, the Westerns of activism and organisation and cultural advances that had made were able to spread to the rest of the country.
And some of that East-West divide, although I think it would be wrong to draw a simple dichotomy between the two sides of Ukraine.
Yes,
but that
that's quite right, yeah.
East-West divide has existed pretty much until present day, right? With the western side of Ukraine more, how should I say, European-leaning, and the eastern side more pro-Russian?
That's absolutely right. And you can see it in the voting patterns every election. And you can also see it quite nicely in when and where Lenin statues were taken down. They started being taken down in the West immediately after independence, whereas in the East, there were still lots up in 2014 when Putin made his grab for Donetsk and Luhansk. I remember interviewing a mayor in the contested little city of Slavyansk, now again on the front line. And it was a very split city. About half the population, according to the mayor, were for Russia and half of them were for Kyiv. And this tension was quite nicely expressed in the Lenin statue, sort of in the middle of the central square, which was still up there, but he had a blue and yellow Ukrainian scarf around his neck. Actually, this kind of quite light-hearted, witty, let's not take this too seriously way of coping with these political divides is actually quite characteristically Ukrainian. I mean, whether it will survive war, I don't know. I mean, for example, the Lenin statue in Odessa at the same period, 2014 to 2015. In Odessa, there was very nasty street fighting at one stage. Somebody dressed it up as Darth Vader. They didn't take it down, but they dressed him up as Darth Vader. And that's characteristic of how the Ukrainians, they sort of deal with these issues in a modern, witty, clever way that the Russians don't. The Russians take it all very seriously. They've got this visceral feeling of injured national pride and lost greatness and wanting to recover it, which the Ukrainians simply don't have. And it's largely because they have no great history of statehood. So it's all building everything from anew. Of course, they've got their heroes. They've got sort of various sort of Cossack leaders and so on you can hark back to. But they're pretty flimsy figures in a way. You can't really point to great achievements. And so people don't take the history that seriously. There is always about looking to the future. And this is one thing Zelensky said in one of his early speeches from the bunker. We're not interested in history lessons. We're looking to the future. And that contrast with Putin and his obsession with history is very, very telling.
History has moved on. Putin may want to restore a greater Russia, but Ukraine doesn't want part of that. You mentioned how Ukraine's modern national movement began in the 1840s. When to begin this story, which dates we choose is an important part of the conversation for Putin, for everyone. On some of my recent podcasts, I have discussed the ways in which the West, however you want to define the West, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, ordinary people who live in the West, how they underestimated Putin, misjudged his motivations. Ian Kershaw and I talked about the importance of Russian ultra-nationalist ideology in motivating Putin. Putin released, or the Kremlin released, the 7,000-word essay on history. You bring this up in your essay in Foreign Affairs. And I often say we should take people at their word. You can read that essay, the translation in my case, and a lot of it seems crazy. But Putin apparently believes what he said in there about Ukraine not really having its own national identity. It's part of Russia. Do you think that when that essay was released, it was dismissed, if it was even noticed at all in the West?
It was noticed, but only amongst specialist Russia-Ukraine watchers. There was some commentary at the time, and I read it at the time, and a cold shiver did go up my spine because it's
like a case for war.
And there was a sort of really nasty fanaticism to it, which was quite new. It starts with Kievan Rus. It starts with the 10th century and the Christianization of Rus, which was this collection of princedoms, of Slav princedoms. It was founded by Viking invaders. King Vladimir the Great, Vladimir to Russians, Vladimir to Ukrainians, Christianized the country. And there's a rather nice story about him sending off emissaries to various other countries. He knew he needed a modern religion. The paganism wouldn't do anymore. They needed to get up to date. And he sent people off to Islamic lands, and they came back, said, we can't eat pork and we can't drink. That's no good. And he sent people off to Catholic Europe, and they said, that's no good because too much fasting and praying. Then he sent people off to Orthodox Greece, and there they came back saying, oh, their churches are beautiful, full of mosaics and glory. So we'll go for that.
Looking back on that essay now, knowing that we have a war on our hands, it does look like Putin was making a case for war. And about the 10th century, some people might be saying, my goodness, we're arguing about what happened in the 10th century 1,000 years ago. But it does matter what happened after Vladimir the Great's reign. That's really where the disagreement begins in the couple of centuries after that about where the center of Russian culture really was. Why don't you pick it up from there, Anna?
Vladimir's descendants fell out amongst themselves. So Kievan Rus had started to fray when in the 13th century there was the Mongol invasion over all of Central Europe. And the Mongols turned Central Europe basically into sort of tributary territories. The native rulers stayed in place, but their job became to collect taxes for the Mongols, pass them on to the Mongol Khans. And they would send their sons and so on off to the Mongol court to be trained up in Mongol culture and, make useful connections. So it became what had been these Christian lands, and there's a very, very east of Europe, became Asianized. They became partly Mongol in culture. And the old argument by Cold War historians like Sir Richard Pipes, for example, is that Russia, Muscovy as it became, the northeast of old Kievan Rus, which remained under Mongol control for much longer than Ukraine, than present-day Ukraine, that it inherited this very top-down, very repressive form of government in a way that Ukraine, which quite quickly fell under Polish rule, Lithuanian rule, and then Polish rule, didn't. I mean, it's going back an awful long way. And there's lots more to talk about the Cossack hetmanate in the 17th century and so on, which gave Ukraine a certain amount of autonomy under sort of split Polish and Russian rule, when there was still a lot of fighting going on over where the eventual border would be drawn.
But you point out it wasn't until the late 17th century that Moscow really enters the picture and begins to dominate what was then Ukraine, right? Why is that an important point here?
Well, the 1680s is when Kyiv finally goes from Polish rule to Russian rule. Before then, you had something called the Treaty of Pereyaslav a few decades before, which was a Cossack leader called Melnitsky. And he had led a Cossack rebellion against the Poles earlier, very bloody fighting for several years. And he ended up signing an alliance. He was also in alliance with the Tatars, the Crimean Tatars, who were basically a sort of offshoot of the Ottoman Empire. And then that alliance broke up, and in desperation, he then turned to Moscow and made an alliance with them. And there's an enormous debate between Ukrainian and Russian historians over what that Treaty of Pereyaslav actually meant. And for Russian historians, it's when Russia liberated their fellow Orthodox, the Ukrainians, from the Polish yoke, gathered the Russian lands. This is the phrase that Putin keeps using.
The gathering of the Russian world.
The gathering of the Russian world or the Russian land, depends how you translate it. But for Ukrainian historians, it was just a temporary expedient. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement under which they still had a lot of rights, and it didn't imply any sort of intention to permanently come under Moscow.
So is this why Putin says that the USSR was wrong to create a Ukraine SSR in 1922? Because Ukraine, going back to this key point, 1680, is really part of Russia. There shouldn't have been a separate Ukrainian identity. Is that why?
What Lenin was doing then, and it was the same policy he adopted towards all the non-Russian ethnic groups, was give concessions, with the deliberate intention, as we've got it on record from his memos to colleagues, of taking away separate ethnic-based rights later. And that is, of course, is what actually happened, because the constituent states of the Soviet Union had no real rights at all. That's simplifying a bit. Some party organizations did have slightly different complexions in different republics. And, some Ukrainian first party secretaries were real hardliners. Some were a bit softer, allowed a bit more Ukrainian language use and so on. But basically everything was decided by Moscow throughout, all the way up to 1991. In 1922, when Lenin was drawing up the structure for his new Soviet state. He was in a weak position still then. He'd only just come out of a long civil war starting back in 1918, and you'd had a big Ukrainian army, in fact, two separate ones. That was one of Ukraine's problems. There was a Western one and there was a Kyiv-based one. And Ukrainian Republic had been declared and so on, and lots of Ukrainian socialists had supported it. And he needed to keep those Ukrainian socialists, the Ukrainian leftists on side, and giving them their own party structure within the Union was a way of doing that.
So in the Second World War, the Nazis, of course, brutalized Ukraine and Russia. But for Putin, the important fact, as you point out in your essay, about the Ukrainians during that horrible conflict was not that 5 million Ukrainians were killed during the war, was that some of them collaborated with the Nazis. So this seems to fit with his pattern of cherry-picking the parts of Ukrainian-Russian history that suits his agenda, does it not?
That's absolutely right. The Western Ukraine was Polish-ruled in between the wars. So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, which divided Poland between Hitler and Stalin, meant the violent occupation of Western Ukraine by the Red Army. So in fact, by Russia for the first time ever in history. It had never been ruled, that area, up till then. So when Germany walks in June 1941, a large chunk of the population welcome them because they see it as a liberation from Soviet rule. And Soviet rule, by the way, had been, as you can imagine, had involved mass shootings, deportations, dispossession, all the usual. And people, of course, very quickly discovered that Nazi rule was at least as bad as Soviet rule. And many, many more Ukrainians fought in the Red Army than fought in the German army. But the Germans were nonetheless able to recruit some Ukrainians into their army. Also, of course, they recruited many Russians into the army. And for both groups, Ukrainian and Russians, this was often the only way of escaping starvation. If you were a prisoner of war under the Germans, there was about a 50% death rate. So one way of not starving to death in a German prisoner of war camp was to agree to join up and fight for the Wehrmacht. So Ukrainians and Russians both did that in large numbers. And the German occupiers also very deliberately recruited Ukrainians into the military police and into the gangs which would shoot Jews, the Holocaust of bullets on the Eastern Front. I mean, it is the same story to the rest of occupied Central Europe and indeed the Baltics. But because Ukraine was the biggest non-Russian nationality in the Soviet Union, Soviet propaganda always made much of this history of collaboration vis-a-vis the Ukrainians in the way they didn't vis-a-vis any of the Warsaw Pact countries or the Balts. And this was because Ukraine was more of a threat to them. And also, I think, because Ukraine is culturally closer to them. And, Ukrainian nationalism was what really had to be crushed, what really had to be wiped out for the Union to feel secure.
So Putin holds grudges over so many of these incidents, events, periods that we've been discussing. The 10th century, the couple of centuries after that, what happened in the 17th century, World War II. But for the first time, when Ukrainians get to choose what they want to do with their country, that's really 1991. And that's another thing that Putin's obviously angry over, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fact that Gorbachev did not use force to try to hold it all together.
That's right. I think it's, in a perverse way, his attempted reconquest of Ukraine is an attempt at re-Westernization. Because you have to remember that Russia today is still an empire. It's still this massive, great land empire stretching all the way to the Pacific. And it contains a good chunk of non-Russians. They're not only the several million Volga Tatars, but you've got Buryats, you've got Sakha, you've got Nivki, you've got Evenki, you've got the Chukchi, the few tens of thousands of Chukchi up in Chukotka, right up on the Bering Strait. All of Siberia, everything east of the Urals is Asia. It's Northern Asia. It's not Europe. And it was conquered by Russia from the 17th century onwards, first of all by Cossack fur trappers. They were the first explorers. And then the sort of state followed and built forts and started collecting tribute from all these Asian nations. And Russia's still got all that. But what it has lost is its Western land empire. And it's the Western land empire which has all the glamour. It has all those sort of ringing historical place names, Sebastopol, Odessa. And it's that Putin feels he wants to regain. It's his place in the European concert of great powers.
Not a new Soviet Union, but he wants to restore Greater Russia because Poland and Ukraine are different in this story. The Baltics, which of course had been dominated by Stalin and the Soviet Union, the Baltics and Ukraine, they're different. Ukraine has a special place, as does Georgia, right? I think that's why the NATO membership issue for both of those places was especially damaging to U.S.-Russia relations. The fact that those two countries might join NATO was different than, say, the Baltic states joining NATO.
I would say Ukraine in particular actually has, Ukraine and Belarus in particular, those three East Slav states, they have a different place in the Russian sense of self from the Georgians or the Poles or the Balts. And it's often said in relation to this conflict is that, if we fall, he'll go for someone else next. Will it be Poland? Will it be Moldova? Will it be Estonia? Will it be Finland? In my experience, Russians don't feel about any of those countries in the same way that they feel about Ukraine. They really do feel that Ukraine is theirs. It's just theirs naturally. And that Ukrainians are really just a species of, subspecies of Russian. They don't feel like that about Lithuanians or Poles.
I agree.
But that said, that is not an argument for not giving our very fullest support to Ukraine, both for the sake of Ukraine and secondly, because we really don't know what's going on inside Putin's head. Anybody who claims they do is fooling themselves.
What are Russia's war aims? Is it possible to know? Because on my most recent episode, I brought up the issue of whether it was time for Ukraine to give up the Donbass. Of course, easy for me to say, sitting here comfortably in my studio in Washington, D.C. But I mentioned a foreign policy article written by Alexander Motil, who is an expert on Russian politics, Russian history at Rutgers University, Newark. The title of the article from 2019, "It's Time for Ukraine to Let the Donbass Go." He argued then, and this was during the Separatist War, that reintegrating the Donbass would be very expensive, and it's a deeply pro-Russian region at a time when Ukraine is moving to the west. He's basically saying everyone would be better off. But now that a major war is underway, easier said than done, right? And what are your feelings on the Donbass as a way of potentially ending the war? Because there needs to be a settlement here. There's not going to be a final victory, a total military victory.
Well, before this war, the idea of just sort of keeping Russia quiet by handing them the Donbass, was touted, but never in public. No politician could have advocated that and stayed in power. Too much blood had been lost, keeping Russians out of most of the Donbass. And Ukrainians all felt that you couldn't trust Putin an inch. If you gave him an inch, he'd take a mile, which, of course, they've been proved absolutely right in. And there was the principle of the thing, this is our territory. However, this is all talking pre the current war. It's a Rust Belt area. It's now war-torn as well as Rust Belt. Very expensive to renew it. And need sort of years and years of economic regeneration projects. The fact that they had lost it in 2014 reduced the pro-Russian voting bloc from about 20% of the vote to about 12% of the vote in every election, which was a big advantage for Ukraine. It meant you got rid of all the people who didn't want reform and wanted to keep all the coal mines open and so on. So the fact that the Donbass had gone as a voting bloc in 2014 had actually helped Ukraine move forward faster with reforms since then. Though no Ukrainian politician was saying, OK, let's write it off. And that, of course, it'd be a total betrayal of the population of the Donbass also, because the so-called referendum that the occupation, the Russian-backed thugs, Orki is the name, all Donbass people call them by, the Orks, who took over the police stations and all the public buildings in 2014. That referendum was not a referendum. It's the wrong word for it. We need a new word for it. It was a bit of theatre.
Kind of like an imposition.
I interviewed the young man who had organised it, in fact, and he boasted to me that it was theatre, that it had nothing to do with reality. It was also clever and postmodern. Appearance was more important than reality. Appearance was the reality. I mean, now we're not at the stage now of any diplomatic negotiations over territory. It's going to be fought out on the ground. I suspect what will happen is that at some point over the summer, hopefully sooner rather than later, Putin digs in. He decides that new offences are too expensive. The whole thing's getting a bit too expensive. And he'll dig in, and the Ukrainians ditto, and we'll go back to the frozen conflict situation with a new line of contact between the two countries further west than it was before.
In the interest of ending the war, an ugly deal might have to be struck.
I don't think it will be a deal that ends the war. I think it'll simply be a military stalemate. And any sort of political settlement making will happen after it. And while Putin's in power, I don't think any sort of stable political settlement is actually possible. The Ukrainians will not trust him, and rightly won't trust him, and nor can the West trust him. He's got a thing about Ukraine.
Yes, as
it's really obvious.
Yeah, and it was underestimated for too long, probably.
And we have underestimated him, and for far too long.
Even though he released a 7,000-word essay telling everyone how he felt about it.
We did read him wrong. I went to, endless sort of Zoom seminars with lots of sort of wise old figures, in the run-up to this war. And when the idea was mooted that Putin was becoming irrational, this was not such an unusual thing. He's been 22 years in power. He had the 2 years of isolation from COVID, which we know he's very paranoid about. People weren't allowed to meet him face to face, except very rarely, and then they had to quarantine themselves before they went into the meetings. But when that idea was floated, it was always slapped down. It was always, no, he's the same old sly fox. We always knew he's cautious, he's calculating. Outright war isn't his style. He likes hybrid war. He likes deniability. He's too clever for that. And we turned out to be totally wrong. And now all bets really are off the table, I think. We can't tell what he's going to do. We really can't tell. And I think we need to prepare for everything, up to and including nuclear. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But the situation we're in now sounded crazy a couple of months ago.
Anna Reid, author of Borderland, A Journey Through the History of Ukraine. And you can read her essay, Putin's War on History in Foreign Affairs. On upcoming episodes of History as It Happens, we're going to talk about the U.S. and Iran. Will the nuclear deal be revived? We're also going to take on the issue of free speech. Who can say what and when, as Elon Musk takes on Twitter? And we'll return to the war in Ukraine and the illusion of total victory. Those topics and more on History as It Happens. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. Subscribe at historyasithappens.com, a podcast from the Washington Times.